So Mark, do you think I should go ahead and start, or should I wait a little bit?
No, let's go ahead and get started. We have the precious time element, and we have a wonderful group of individuals to move forward. So
Great.
let's roll.
So thank you, all of you, for joining the federal policy section. You all should feel free to unmute in order to join the discussion. I want to do this very differently. Paul Desaw has been gracious enough to join us. And I would like this to be more of a dialogue between you. If you have questions to ask, please ask them, but don't feel restricted on that. If you've got stuff to say, you should please say it. So does anybody want to start off? Mark.
This is something that's based off of dialogue with Sarah at Land of Sky. It's the human capital. Doug Dawson talks about how the aging workforce in the telecom industry is disappearing. Paul Desaw, I haven't heard any mention about what is our federal government doing to encourage the education of the necessary human capital, boots on the ground, to take the funding that's available, implement the logistics of this. So I'm opening this up for any dialogue, just because it seems to be the next natural step. And we heard reference from Nathan Huff, on that as well. Charlie, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Huff.
I was going to say it's an issue that is definitely on the radar screen now. It actually came up a lot during the transition. I don't think it was really on people's radar screens that much. The workforce training, both in the context of job creation and also in the context, as you said, of the pipeline, because these are going to be, good paying jobs that are going to be around for a long time as, these networks get built out. So it is on the radar screen of the government. There was a report that the previous FCC did actually exactly on this topic of the job training and the job pipeline, which is a good resource to build on. So I can't say, what exactly the policy's going to be, but I'll tell you, all the carriers are talking to the government about it. It's on the, people are aware of the issue. I don't think there'd been a realization of what a bottleneck the labor piece was, and also, making sure that people who are building government subsidized networks are getting paid adequate wages too, making sure, the salaries are adequate. But it will be part of the broadband puzzle. I'm totally confident of that.
Yeah, Doug Dawson and Bill Sederberg, myself, we met with our community college leaders, Laura Leatherwood and Dr. John Gossett, and they want to implement the education programs, but it ultimately comes down to the funding, and this isn't a high priority for them. So I'm glad to hear that you're having dialogue on that. Thank you.
No, absolutely. It's a super important point. And I got to say, I think people who are sort of deep in the weeds on telecom policy, it's not something that sort of crosses people's minds, right? The whole job training thing. And so it's a super important point.
I have a question in regards to the barrier created by the manner in which the FCC mapping works or doesn't work for rural areas, and this notion that perhaps the federal government could send funds to states as block funding, where the states could then, we're mapping at a more granular level. We know our community needs better. We already have a grant program. What is the likelihood of that? And should we be pushing hard for that?
So were you involved in the previous mapping program and under the first Obama administration, like the 09-010 one that NTIA did? Were you involved in that? So that was much more of a state-driven effort, essentially. This one, I think it's, in all honesty, very unlikely, because Congress has given the FCC $100 million to get this map done. right? And then the FCC has put out processes and procedures for the states and localities to input data and verify data. I don't think the FCC can actually, I don't think by law they're allowed to take any of that $100 million and kind of subcontract out to, or block
I
grant out.
actually mean more along the lines of implementation funds, like rather than doing a RDOF type program decided at the federal level, could the money come to the states as block grants for broadband implementation?
Well, oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that was where my question
was. Yeah.
If it's worth working on.
It's absolutely being discussed. So for example, in the bill that Greg mentioned, Congressman Clyburn's bill, 25, so of the 80 billion, 25% goes to states. 75% is allocated by the federal government. In the December Relief Act, NTI, I believe, is giving some of that money via states. So there's some that goes through HBCUs, and some of it I think is meant to go through states. If I could be mistaken, but it's certainly a discussion. And as I say, that the Clyburn bill, which is sort of the template for forward looking, does have on the deployment side a 25% to states mandate. I'll tell you, people again, to tell me if you disagree. I mean, I think the sense in DC is because the states have such different capabilities and such different interests that there's a little hesitancy. I mean, I think someone in the chat said, because North Carolina has this proven great program, then it should give the federal government some confidence in block granting to the states. That, in my mind, that makes total sense, right? I mean, there's some states you give them a block grant, probably it wouldn't do much in terms of solving the problem, right? New York, as you know, probably took the CAF2 money. So I'm in New York. New York State has basically solved the deployment problem because they took the federal money in 2000 and the CAF2 money, so 2009-ish, 2010, and ran their own deployment auction. And basically New York, they did their own mapping, they did their own auctions. They said, we only want to build wireline 100 meg service. They did 3 rounds of auctions. I mean, more or less, the New York deployment problem is solved, right? But you couldn't expect all the states, I think, to have that same, state capability and state funding and state attention. And we were doing the Time Warner Charter merger, so they had some merger conditions, and so they were. I'm not saying New York is a model for everyone, but there are clearly states who are interested in doing this and have capabilities. And I do think there will be money kind of coming to them directly.
Yeah, but Paul, I'm thinking of the New York example. Wasn't that a really painful process for the state of New York that was second guessed by the FCC over and over again? In order to get to yes, it was just really tough.
Well, so it was tough to get the money. So CAF2 was a federal program, and New York was the only state that made a big push to get the money out of the FCC. So New York, so that was very painful because they were asking for as always in New York, like, we're special, we want the exception, we're going to take the money and do it ourselves. So that was super painful. Once they got the money, then it was, I mean, it was hard for them to know what to do with it, I think, and it took them some time, but they came up in the end with an incredibly effective, in my opinion, program and got it done. So I think that was the pay. Once they got the cash, it was okay.
Yeah, Tim, go ahead.
Thanks, Greg. Tim Love, Buncombe County. I just wanted to chime in on Sarah's comment, and not to pile on Paul, but I just want to make sure we understand how detrimental these FCC maps are. As an example, Madison County on the FCC map that was used as part of the Great Grant scoring here in North Carolina showed 0 unserved homes across the entire county. And that is so bad that it's not even comical, to be honest. And so there's actual decisions being made on this information right now, and it's just really unfortunate. And we were able to advocate in a different way, but it's unfortunate that such blatantly inaccurate data continues to shape how these deployments are occurring. And Paul, I'm not blaming you for this. I just want to make sure that everyone is aware, because if they're not defending themselves, they need to, in terms of developing their own data or whatever it is. But that's secondary to my real comment and question, which is about federal policy. And this may not be possible, but it seems painfully obvious to me that coordination and partnership between providers and utility providers, electric providers, is a clear path to moving the needle quickly on an issue that everyone says is important. And I understand why these things don't happen quickly at a local or state level, but it seems like they could be encouraged directly through federal or some other type of regulation that gets providers and electric providers to play together nice so that we can actually connect our kids to the internet. So.
Yeah, no, well, so I mean, look, for what it's worth, I mean, I totally agree with both of those. I mean, on the mapping, this has been a known problem since the 2009 original maps, right? I mean, and the last administration did nothing on mapping, essentially. You know, it wasn't entirely their fault. Congress only gave them money to do maps. Congress basically said, you cannot do anything until we give you money, and then didn't give any money. So to be fair to the FCC, they were completely hamstrung, right? They had an unfunded mandate and weren't allowed to do anything, and that money just came through in December. But I'm with you. I mean, it's been as I said, it's been a known problem, and you can't address this problem without proper maps. And I'll tell you, look, I mean, I think, as I said, one of the big challenges is going to be you guys on the ground know the situation. It's going to be, even with the money, very difficult for the FCC to do this nationwide and find every single location that is unserved. I mean, that is a huge, I mean, there is no resource in the country, even Google Maps, that actually has an accurate map of just the locations, forget whether they're served by broadband or not, but just the actual locations that could potentially have or need broadband. There's no entity in the country that has that, public or private. The FCC now has to create that, and then they have to overlay on that what's served by mobile broadband, what's served by fixed broadband, what could be served, and then use that as a basis. So this is a huge, huge challenge for the commission. And I will say, look, I think they're very keen for help from the people on the ground like yourselves who actually know the situation, because you go by these locations every day, right? Or every month. I mean, you know what's going on. So I really would encourage you to, I mean, I know you've got a million things going on, but really to try and keep an eye on that process, which is just starting now, literally. Like, money came in December, the task force got kicked off like 2-3 weeks ago. This mapping process is really just starting. It's going to be a 12 to 18 month journey. And I mean, really, to the extent you can be helpful, or you see the commission doing things that are wrong, or you have better information, I mean, I think they really would be actually very, very keen for any help they can get. And, you know, to be fair, I will say, look, the maps were right within incorrect premise, right? So the premise was one location in the census block served. Let's call the whole census block served. Within that premise, the maps are right. The trouble is that premise makes no sense, but that premise has been around for 15 years. So, you know, it's sort of well overdue to be gotten rid of. You know, I'm sorry. I was going to answer the other piece about the electricity stuff.
No, go ahead, and then Susan had to comment. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the other point about the electricity, the utilities, and I think there's two things to say. The one is, per the French broad speaker, you know, it's amazing that we have seen co-ops and IOUs to some extent, but co-ops really get into, like, they want a lot of money in CAF2, they want a lot of money in RDOF. I think they have a lot of advantages. You know, the trouble is the FCC is in this position, right? People are unhappy when they give money to the incumbent providers, because the incumbent providers have been sitting around doing nothing for 20 years. So why are you giving those, you know, the telco and the cable company money? Then they're unhappy when people give them to startups, because people say, well, that guy has no track record, he's not going to be able to deliver. And actually, the IOU, the co-ops and the IOUs are perfectly in the middle, right? People trust them, they're in the community, they're providing service, they have a relationship with the customers, they have a field force, they have the polls, but they kind of have more of an attacker mindset, right? They know they want to get the fiber out and serve people. It's not like the telephone company or the cable company who are sort of trying to protect their incumbent status. And so I think you're right. I mean, I think it's been actually a shift of the FCC to let electricity companies get subsidies and enter the space. And it's, I think, you know, to the extent it's not prohibited by state law in some states, it's going to be, I think, a big thing. And sorting out this whole pole attachments, and there was a whole thing in the chat going right about pole attachments. I mean, I'll tell you there, as you guys know, right? I mean, there are literally dozens of lawyers in DC who've spent their entire lives and do nothing except pole attachment law, right? And so this is like way above my head. I mean, they spent, the last 35 years doing it. But finally, people are recognizing again that this just needs to get solved, right? It's kind of absurd that the nation's connectivity rests on some minutiae of pole attachment law. And so, I think people are going to look at it. Again, to be fair, it is a real issue, right? I mean, it's all great until an electricity pole falls on someone, right? Or, whole neighborhood's electricity gets taken out because the fiber overweighted the loading on the pole. So look, I mean, this is a serious issue. I don't want to, make light of it, but I think, people recognize that it can't be a sustainable bottleneck. I don't know, Timothy, does that make sense? Is that?
Thanks. I appreciate you taking my candor well. So
yeah. No, but you're totally right.
Susan was next.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be involved in this. I'm an economist, and I've done work in public utilities and environment, sustainability, a bunch of things. Done work about the importance of broadband in Western North Carolina in the 1990s. So it's been an issue that's been on my mind for a long time. I'm also a customer, and as a customer, so I have some questions about affordability. So I'm glad you discussed the pole issue, because that one to me is such a no-brainer, but I understand the law and the legality around it. But also the public utilities, the electric companies are regulated utilities. And a lot of those poles, and they were originally subsidized, almost 100 years ago to expand electricity. So it seems to me that there might be some room for federal policy on that. The concern I have around affordability is the monopoly power of the internet companies. And I've seen this in pricing. I've seen this, locally, my own experience, anecdotal experience at friends. And it seems to me that it's time to label the internet service as an essential service, and then a public utility, and then classify it for regulation. In North Carolina, what little competition there was, I don't know when the acts came in back in the late 90s, I think, early 2000s, that prevented municipal supply of internet service, essentially prevented competition. So the competition is essentially not at all there. And we certainly don't want multiple, building of infrastructure by the private sector, because that wastes resource. So it's just like electric supply, water supply, natural gas supply. And so what is the potential for federal policy to come in and begin to look at internet service as a public utility and regulate it at the state, federal levels appropriately, both in quality of supply and pricing for customers, to avoid monopoly pricing, which is what currently exists?
I don't know, Brian, if you want to give a perspective from Charter, I can say that from the federal experience. I mean, look, I would say in reality, from the federal perspective, just to be like personal view, there's basically zero chance of price regulation of broadband. I just think, I think the incumbents are too powerful, really, to get it done. I think it's actually very hard because, unlike many of the other infrastructure areas, for better or worse, right? I mean, this is private infrastructure, right? I mean, the cable companies have invested billions of dollars of private infrastructure. They have shareholders, telcos. You can argue a bit of how much, exactly as you said with the electric poles, that was under rate maker versus post. But generally, I just don't see in the discourse any real discussion of price regulation. And even if broadband gets reclassified as a Title II service, which people sort of run around and say is utility, like you know, every administration that's done Title II, which has been, you know, the first Obama administration proposed it and then didn't do it. Chairman Wheeler did it. Probably the new chair under the Biden administration will do it. But all of them have taken out the price regulation piece, or said they're not going to do it. And, you know, to be fair, part of that is too, look, the FCC does no price regulation at the moment, right? I mean, there used to be hundreds of people in the FCC doing retail price regulation. And then with the deregulation in the 90s and beyond, that machinery got taken away. And so, you know, it's very hard. I mean, as economists, you would appreciate this, right? I mean, if someone said to you, okay, you Susan, you're in charge, right? You're the broadband price czar. You have to come up with the prices, right? What, you know, maybe a rate of return model or price cap model, or you need a model, or you need a TELRIC model, or you need some,
right.
Like, I mean, you know, as you know, right, it would take you probably longer than any chair of the FCC has to come up with prices that are sustainable in court, right, under the authority of the regulators. And so practically, it's just you know, unless Congress, you know, gets up tomorrow, which is what happened in '92 with the Cable Act, right? Unless Congress says, look, FCC or whoever, your job is to regulate broadband prices. Short of that.
But they do regulate electricity and state level public utilities. I mean, there is
Correct.
the model there, and the provision of internet is so similar to electricity. Yes, there is the, you know, previous ownership. We built our current infrastructure, but the companies are currently getting tons of subsidies to expand. So it seems to me that there's room to begin a process of at least incentivizing.
Look, as I say, I'm not defending it. I think if we set up, you know, Susan Land tomorrow, or green sheet of clean sheet of paper in Susan Land, like I'm guessing, and in Paul Land, probably broadband would be a utility. Yeah. To your point, right? The trouble is, I think, you know, given all the history and the current providers and the current industry structure, look, I'm not, as I say, I'm not disagreeing. I'm just sort of making a kind of practical point.
So if that's the case, I'll ask one last sort of follow-up, and I agree with you, and I don't see it happening at the federal level or the state level, and I don't see price regulation happening. I think it needs to be talked about, but I get it, that it's just the current state of the world makes it so difficult. If that's the case, then competition promotion, because there is almost no competition. I know that, you know, currently where I live, there's one provider. Sometimes there were two, sometimes there was one. It goes back and forth. It's changed over the last 20 years. But in North Carolina, we don't allow competition, essentially, not by municipal providers who would be the ones who could come in and essentially either be nonprofit, or profit maximum would not be their primary goal. Mm-hmm. Providing quality supply, you know, and meeting profit constraints would be their business model. And so we have to allow those kind of competitors, or else we have a, you know, monopoly situation. Anyway, we're in agreement, I guess.
Yeah, I think, but I would, tell me if you agree. Look, I mean, I think actually even having 2 or 3, like the oligopoly is not going to do much better on pricing than the monopoly, right? No. And then going back, right? And then going back to your point, you're not likely to really have more than 2 or 3 facilities-based providers, right? I mean, the economics don't work for the 4th guy building a fiber. Right. So that then, I mean, sort of by elimination, I think leads you to 2 things, right? It either leads you to intermodal competition. So, for example, will the new fleet of satellites, which have a totally different economic cost structure, constrain prices or provide competition? You know, maybe I think the Starlink entry price is $99, right? So that says that's not really going to be doing a lot for pricing. No. On the other hand, look, when Amazon has their fleet of satellites up, could you imagine Amazon, you know, giving you broadband for $20 on Prime? You know, again, doesn't help everyone, but that might have some impact as a price constraint. You know, 5G mobile substitution. maybe, but fundamentally, again, you know better than I do being an economist, right? It's an oligopoly kind of market.
Yeah.
And price competition is never really going to solve your problem. And so then the question is, do the localities or the states want to do something? And it was interesting. Look, I mean, Verizon in their latest federal proposal said, look, we support actually municipalities doing, if that's what people want, and the municipality wants to do it, and that's a need, we actually support it. And that was a change of position for Verizon. I mean, they've been fighting.
The best structure to create competition, more price competition in oligopoly is the contestability model, which is allow entry and just the threat of entry.
Right.
And that's what the state of North Carolina took away. And
Right.
if we're not going to price regulate, then we
Correct.
must allow the threat of entry of municipalities to provide price competitive. And I know the municipalities, not all of them would, but there's some that were successful in North Carolina in the past.
Correct.
And then you see co-ops. And so allow subsidizing them, but you've got to allow that entry, and current state law doesn't allow it. So the FCC policy can be to promote entry. Anyway, I'll be quiet.
Aaron, sorry to cut you off, but Brian, did you have a point you wanted to make?
I was going to go back to the polls if you were interested in having a discussion about that. I know this is kind of a little bit of a federal look, but to get into these rural areas, and what we're really trying to do is get to unserved areas. And I completely understand that there are unserved pockets of urban areas as well, but the rural challenge is quite difficult because the number of poles that you need to attach to and the number of potential customers out there. The cable companies don't typically own any of that infrastructure to get on the poles. It's extremely expensive to go underground, and in the mountain areas, it's even more difficult because of the terrain. The challenge that we're looking at ways to try to figure out, and will include likely state legislation, is the process of make ready and the utility pole replacements, because a lot of these poles that have been sitting out there for decades may or may not have to be replaced to put this new infrastructure on. And the electric cooperatives have no current regulation as to how long it takes for them to make those poles ready for broadband, or what they could charge the provider for getting onto those poles, because a lot of times the poles need to be replaced, and they say, well, the pole's working just fine now, even though it's been here for 30 years. It's $7,000 a new pole, and the broadband provider is really stuck. So the investor-owned utilities, the Dukes and Dominions of the world, they have to follow some federal guidelines. And we're trying to figure out, okay, in these areas that are unserved, how do we get into a streamlined process where we know that we can count on certain timelines for that make ready to be done, so we're not waiting 6 months to a year just on the polls. So I just was making that point. I didn't know if anybody else wanted to take it. I see Paul's nodding his head, so I must have made some sense in what I was saying.
I would just like to add some context too to the rural conversation, serving a very rural 7-county region where we only have one co-op providing broadband. So, I see that held up as a solution to the rural problem a lot, but it's not going to be a solution for a very large portion of Western North Carolina, where we're served by Duke Energy, who has no interest in providing broadband.
Yeah, I mean, some just rough figures. I mean, we think that it could be 20 or 30 or maybe in some cases even more % of a project when we're going to go on applications or just a normal build. So if we know there's a lot of what this make ready or pole replacements in these unserved areas, that sometimes knocks it out of the park and being able to be considered. And then when we're going for funding in these high cost areas, we know that it's significant. So that's why we're looking at ways to try to keep that under control. And we've got a huge project ahead of us with RDOF, and 6 years I know is a long time, but we're wanting to do it faster. And if we can have some certainty in our timelines and cost, I think that'll help everybody. And I think folks are going to be willing to sit down, and I hope folks are be willing to sit down and talk to us, the pole owners and others. But it is a real concern that we have, not just nationally for charter, but specifically in North Carolina.
So thank you very much. Frank had his hand up for a while ago.
Thank you, Greg. My background is actually electric and gas utilities, former consultant and utility executive. There is a genuine issue with the age of the pole infrastructure. Poles 60 years old have more cables and wires on them that are almost holding up the poles, if you will, that need to be replaced. And the design of the pole is such that the power is always at the top, right? And you work your way down with the less obtrusive utilities. And if you could start anew with a system, you could design the pole so it would accommodate everyone who wanted to go on it. And the problem is they weren't designed that way. So the cost to a utility to redo that, unless you had some kind of revenue sharing model that worked from a IOU perspective, is just a no-starter. So Paul, I see you're shaking your head in agreement. I did have a question for you, Paul. With regard to cooperatives, do you see anything at the federal level that would encourage more French Broad type activity? Because we do have another cooperative here in Western North Carolina that so far has been reluctant. And we have talked to them from a Western North Carolina broadband project perspective to see if we could generate some interest. But is there anything you see at a federal level that could be done in that area?
I mean, I'll tell you, I think the federal government is very excited about co-ops. And as I said, I think they've made all the funding streams, but formerly many of them were only for telcos and cable companies, open to co-ops. I really think at this point, it's really a co-op by co-op decision as to their interest and the risk tolerance that they're willing to take in terms of making the investment in broadband. Yeah, and I guess I'm fortunate. I feel it's like at this point it's a co-op by co-op decision. And as they see more co-ops getting into it and being successful, I hope that will encourage more to take on the entry. One of the advantages also of co-ops is I think they serve all their members, right? So you don't have this kind of problem of carving out the areas where people can afford the service and only building there. They really build out their entire footprint, which again is something that the federal, like the FCC, really likes, right? The universality of that. In conversations with co-ops that I've had, and I had a lot in the context of RDOF, it really tended to be more just a risk reward thing, because building out the broadband, obviously most of the investment is in the first year or two, and then you get that investment back as your customers pay their bills for the next 5 years. And so it can often be then a material kind of risk, just for pure financial risk for the board, in terms of saying, yeah, we're willing to spend X million dollars on this broadband endeavor. In my mind, at least, that was the main barrier for the co-ops, being able to do this. And so maybe just saying that, there is, again, in Congressman Clyburn's bill, there is some effort to change the funding to allow people to raise money, how you can raise money if you're building broadband. So that might help, perhaps, if some of the co-ops have access to a lower cost stream of capital. That might help a little bit. But I don't know, Frank, if that makes any, does that make any sense? Does that tie with your experience?
Yeah, we've always viewed, I think, broad, a cooperative, an electric cooperative is basically low-hanging fruit for broadband, because the economics really do work. The problem is the management tends to be very conservative.
Right.
They want to stick to what they know. And so for them to make that kind of risk on behalf of their members is a real challenge. But there's many successful cooperative models out there that have introduced broadband, and just like to encourage them to step up to the plate.
Yes. No, and I think that tide really is going that way. I mean, the thing I would keep an eye on, again, just being slightly cynical, is going back to what Susan was saying about this. There is a counter argument that some of the incumbents are making about, well, the co-ops are basically unfairly subsidizing broadband by allocating broadband costs to their electricity ratepayers. Mm-hmm. And so I would just keep an eye on that personally, right? As the co-ops get scale and become more of a real force and more of a competitive force, that you might get this sort of backlash a little bit in terms of, trying to keep them out or put them under a little bit more scrutiny, which again may be fair or may not be fair. But I mean, I feel like the tide is certainly swimming with the co-ops at the moment, because they did get all this money in CAF2 and RDOF, and if they deliver on that, which hopefully they will, that'll be a great then kind of case study for further activity.
So thank you, Alan. You had your hand up.
Thank you. I'm Alan Fitzpatrick, and a little background so you know where my bias is coming from. I run a competitive ISP here in North Carolina. So just to tag along to what Susan was saying earlier about competition being valuable in the marketplace, improve services, improve speeds, lower costs, you get all those things from competition, right? One of the policy issues we run into is this concept of overbuilding. And the term overbuilding to me is a positive thing. Overbuilding to me means competition. There are multiple providers improving their service, lowering the prices for the user. It seems though that when the grant programs come out, overbuilding is viewed as a negative term. That, oh, we can't overbuild, that would be wrong. But yet everything we know about competition is that overbuilding is good. It's a good thing to do. Is there any thought from a policy perspective of flipping this term of overbuilding to a positively viewed item?
Well, so I'll make 2 points on that, because it's a fair point. I mean, I think it's actually really a prioritization issue. So here's a question for you, right? If you had let's say you knew the need to get broadband to everyone was $1,000, but your budget was only $500 just to serve people with no provider at all, right? Then the question is, okay, that $500, are you going to spend it in areas with no provider, or are you going to provide it to overbuild in areas with more than one provider? And I think it's not, I mean, that's a legitimate policy question, right? I mean, should I take that $500 and help people go from one provider to two providers, or two providers to three providers, because that overbuilding is going to have good competitive effects? Or should I take that money and spend it on people who have no providers, so that at least they have one, right? And it's not mutually exclusive. You could spend 50% on one and 50% on that. But I don't think this is a, just if you don't mind to slightly disagree with the framing, I don't think it's a policy view that overbuilding is bad per se, right? I think there is a whole parallel discourse, right, of one provider, two provider, three providers, competition is good and beneficial. I think this is purely just a budget constraint, which is, if we've got limited resources and they're inadequate, even for the people who have nothing to go to one, then really we don't want to be spending that money on the people who have one to go to two, or two to go to three. I don't know. Does that? I don't know if that makes.
Oh, it does. We recently had a county in Western North Carolina that got denied grant funding because one of the incumbents objected that the mapping data was wrong, and then essentially the whole county got nothing when they would have gotten a great grant.
Well, so I mean, that, I think, if you don't mind, is a separate and really important issue, right? Which is, and it goes back to the mapping piece that Timothy was talking about, right? Which is, look, if I'm an incumbent, and sorry, Brian, I don't mean to keep beating on incumbents. Don't take it as a anti-charter thing, but just conceptually, right? And actually, AT&T did the most of this, right? Suppose the following is true, right? I have a bunch of unserved area that might be eligible for RDOF, right? And then some other company might come in as a subsidized competitor. What did they do, right? They went and they put up, one fixed wireless tower that served one location, and then that whole area, because of this one location, all location thing, that whole area got taken out of the auction. And similarly, I think a lot of states and localities have the same issue, which is, it's a terrible incentive, right? I mean, let's say I'm a state and I'm willing to fund broadband like the GREAT program. I know that if I fund a location, then it's going to get taken out of the federal money. So I'm sort of kind of disqualifying myself from federal money. And historically, it's been even worse, right? Because if I fund one location, as you said, that whole census block might get taken out. So, I fund 10 locations and the other 90 locations that are unserved all get taken out too. And that's obviously a terrible incentive then for states and localities who are trying to help their people by providing broadband. That problem, I think, will go away now that we're moving to doing this stuff on a location basis, right? So you don't have this kind of one served, all served, you know, as Timothy was saying, like on the map, it looks like everyone's served, even though it's only like 2% of the locations or 10% of locations. Now that that aggregation is going away and the FCC is really going to be looking on a location by location basis, I think that problem, like the state funding taking it out of the federal pool might not get solved, right? Because you don't want, legitimately, you don't want double funding, right? You don't want the FCC to be subsidizing the area that the state is just subsidized and the subsidized and the provider getting 2 subsidies. So you don't want double dipping. But I think the kind of, you know, taking unserved locations out by sort of strategically just serving 1 or 2 in the census block, that problem I think is going to get solved in the next in future funding streams. So sorry, that was a longer answer than you expected. I know, does that make sense? Is that?
It does. Doug Dawson is too bad he's not in this group. He had an interesting post the other day about how advertised feeds can often be a lot more than what's really delivered. So there's that whole gaming of the system. It's kind of hard to stop, right? Somebody says they offer 25 megabit speed, but they really don't deliver that. And then it rules that area out for other opportunities. So it's a tough question.
It is, and look, I mean, the FCC does do speed tests, and they do, you know, with the RDOF money, they're going to do spot checks on the networks to make sure people are really delivering what they're promising. You know, I'll tell you, I think the piece of the mapping machine that is going to be very helpful for this is, so the maps that the FCC is going to do by law, by the Broadband Data Act, have to really allow public input and public checking and public data. Because at the moment, let's say you're sitting there and your provider isn't giving you the speed they promised. Like, there's not really, like, what do you do, right? I mean, like, who do you go to? Who do you write to? Like, who does anything? Like, it's not so easy. Like, this portal will, as I say, by law, give a mechanism for the FCC to collect that data, for that report to be made public. Because I think even if it's just peer pressure, right? Even if, you know, 20 people in one county are all complaining about the service, that's probably going to result in the provider sort of at least paying attention. And so I think this part of the machine, the mapping machine that's being built over the next year, will actually be extremely helpful. I mean, again, look, I'm not promising it's going to solve everything, but I think it'll be helpful in addressing this sort of what do you do when people don't deliver and you have no choice kind of problem.
Well, and we need to wrap it up here. I think we're going to abruptly get thrown back into the large group here in just a few seconds, but thank you everybody for participating. This was a very interesting discussion.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope that was good for you guys. Bill, you want to help us out?
Thanks to everybody for hanging in here. When we designed this program, if you recall, when we did the last summit at noon, we kind of stopped and said, stay around and have lunch and meet with various people to chat. So that was the format. And to have as many people hang in there for this long, I'm very impressed with your commitment, and you all deserve some sort of prize for doing that. We're going to have a quick report from each of the 4 groups and then a wrap up. And so let's start first with Arthur Solito, talk about funding. I don't see Arthur signing on. So we switch to Greg.
Okay, I'm here.
Oh, there you are, Arthur.
I was prevented from unmuting myself. I talk too much, apparently. So in our session, we talked about grants from the FCC, the great grants, ARC, partnerships between the HHS and rural health, the internet office. And a couple of things to note. Comporium down in Transylvania County was recently announced a grant award to help with broadband implementation there. Let's see, we also mentioned Charter's commitment to following through on RDEF funds, and I believe it was Mike Tank from Charter who mentioned that in addition to the public funding that they're getting, they're also putting a lot of private funds into these projects. So we're grateful for that. And we ended with David Brown, I believe, thanking Bill Cedarberg for his dogged relentlessness in keeping this all going, which is totally true. And grateful for Bill. So I'm sure I missed a bunch, but that was
an excellent report. Although it wasn't Dave, it was Matt Pearsall who was commenting on that. So, but thanks for the thought anyway. Greg Vogt, on talking about with Paul, continued that conversation.
Right. In the federal policy group, Paul, thank you very much for joining that group where we had more in-depth conversation about federal policy. And we talked about the need for more competition from municipal organizations involved in order to make sure pricing was lower. We also talked about the difficulty with pole attachment regulation and how it was very expensive for certain providers to get on existing poles, and that there was more work that needed to be done in that area. And finally, there was a strong statement that there needs to be more block grants to states to allow states to fund their own programs. In fact, it was a model that the FCC itself used in New York State that was very successful in building out broadband in New York. And that's what we talked about.
Great. Sounds good. And Stag Newman with Walter Johnston. Stag. Stag must have gone to feed his horses or something.
We're unmuting him, Bill.
Okay. I enjoy giving Stag a hard time, so this is delightful. So unmute Stag.
Okay. Yeah, first I'd like to thank Walter. We mainly took advantage of Walter's technical expertise to answer a lot of questions. I think I'd summarize the technology this way: is we need an all of the above solution because of the high cost in our mountains, because of our granite and our rocks and our beautiful hills and all. So we need deep fiber, and then people need high-speed tails, and those can be fiber to the curb by companies like River Street, French Broad Electric, AT&T, or Comporium. Can also be the hybrid fiber coax networks by companies like Spectrum, Charter, Morris. Also, I think Comporium has some high speed. And wireless has a very important role to play because some places we just don't have the fixed wired infrastructure. And that's a Skyrunner or an Open Broadband. There are quite a few other wireless providers in the further western counties that I won't try to name all of them. And cellular has a good role to play, but you really only get the superior cellular performance if you're really close to a cell site. So that means, again, more deep fiber, more cell sites. And the way we solve these problems is working together to aggregate demand and come up with enough funding to close the business case. And a lot of that cost is unfortunately not to do with technology. It's the civil engineering and permitting and just the nitty-gritty hard stuff.
Thank you, Stag. And now to Jeff McDarris, School Superintendent in Transylvania County, also a partner with us on the My Future NC, and an impressive guy. So Jeff, I haven't talked to you before on this, but welcome and thanks for doing this. Did your group break apart with fistfights on the virtual world or something?
Well, we're celebrating Dr. Seuss here today, but let me give you some rapid fire takeaways from our meeting, which was great. First of all, very impressive. Educators so many individuals we turned on a dime, quite frankly, and we're able to put out some ability to do remote learning pretty quickly. Partnerships are incredibly important. This has made us all more tech savvy. It was a monumental effort and continues to be to provide accessibility to some families in areas that are not that far off the beaten path, but they just cannot get a signal to them. There are some places that just cannot be reached. We need more broadband than you think. My takeaway on that would be like the Atlanta interstate system years ago when I would go down and watch the Braves. When they built 2 lanes, they realized they needed 4. And I think that we're finding that out increasingly from the conversations that, especially in households where you have multiple students and parents that need to be on at the same time. Professional development is critical, cannot be overlooked. Certainly laptops versus desktops. Cybersecurity is something that everyone needs to be thinking about as we broaden our base out there. And we cannot overlook the importance of social emotional contacts with people as they are somewhat out on an island. But I will close by saying the creativity out there is heightened and it's actually very enriching. And I think really the sky's, there's no limit. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Unbelievable that we're kind of right on schedule, but I noticed that Mark Hoyt signed on, and Mark was with us at the very beginning of this whole process. Mark, I'm going to ask you for a 1-minute summary of what you heard and any quick thoughts. We need to unmute Mark. Well, so much for Mark's quick thoughts.
There we go. Maybe.
Oh, there we go. Okay, Mark.
Sorry about that. I didn't realize it was locked. Sarah, you locked me out. So I'm impressed at the diversity and the breadth that this group and collaboration has gotten to. I remember a much smaller group when we started, mostly city and county folks, and now it's including a huge, enormous group, and it seems to be making great progress. I want to thank Sarah for her comment about it's not just connectivity anymore. I know there are people not connected. I understand the problems, but there are so many more people that have connectivity and don't know how to use the technology, don't have the education, don't have the pieces that make it useful and make them be able to join the rest of society and do those kind of things. So please focus on that as your next step and help people understand how to use the technology, and then help us behind the scenes get the stuff ready so everybody can keep connecting and getting your work done.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And finally, when we organized all this, we were really impressed with comments that Sarah Thompson made. She's done a great job leading the Southwest Commission. And Sarah, why don't you wrap it all up for us and send us on our way?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. The planning committee thought maybe we should end this with a call to action, so I'll do my best. This is a regional issue, and Sarah Nichols' organization, Nathan Ramsey with Land to Sky Regional Council, and us with the Southwestern Commission Councils of Government are regional planning organizations. So continue to work with us. We've been working on this issue for years now. Let's work together on this. We've done a ton of planning and mapping, and we're currently promoting the heck out of the state survey so we can get some more accurate maps. Also, continue to organize locally, work with your providers, befriend all the experts that are on today's call. Let's keep them in our region helping us move this issue. The broadband landscape is constantly shifting and is going to continue to do so. It's a regional, statewide, national issue that's going to be solved and advanced at the community level. So the solution in one community may not mirror the solution in a neighboring community, and there's a lot of variables at play here. Let's continue to advocate, educate your stakeholders, encourage them to advocate. Are there funding programs that aren't working? Let's figure out how to get them to work better. Are the FCC maps faulty? Let's fix them. Should we be seeing federal funds passed down as block grants? Let's advocate for that. And, you know, throughout this call this morning, I've been thinking that maybe we need a stronger, more organization around advocacy on this issue in Western North Carolina. And I think the COGS could really help with that. So thank you all for your continued perseverance on this incredibly important issue. We're living in very interesting times. Technology is changing rapidly, and the future of our rural communities especially are sure to be brighter if we get high-speed broadband out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And now comes the point on the program where all the credits roll at the end. Just a quick thanks for Sarah Nichols, who worked so hard on this. And Sarah does a great job with Land of Sky. We have a couple students from UNCA, Anitra Griffin and Elias Landsman, who have helped put this all together. Paul Moon, also from Land of Sky. Thanks, Paul, for your work. Mark Zarnecki with the website and on the technology side. Thanks to everybody that has participated on this. And I know a lot of you would just like to keep talking broadband, but I'm hungry for lunch and I want to go and end this. So thanks to everybody, and we'll be in touch. You got some great written material that we've sent you. Be sure to read that and get it all printed out and distributed all around your neighborhood. So with that, have a great day. And Chancellor Brown, is it okay that we sign off now? I see you're still with us. Keep those catamounts working hard down there. Okay. Bye-bye, y'all.
Bye.